So hello, my name is Janet Mason, and tonight we're going to be exploring Carp Cafeteria, which is all about the biodiversity that is available for nature in the Carp Hills. So the photos tonight, they're all mine unless labeled otherwise, and all the photos were taken in the Carp Hills, again, unless labeled otherwise. I've taken photos from many sources. Most of them come from iNaturalist, from the observations of people who've uploaded their images there, but also have taken some graphics from some of these organizations here. So tonight we're going to cover what is biodiversity. We have to understand what it is before we can talk about it, and we need to understand why it's important to us, humanity. We'll talk about the biodiversity in the Carp Hills, the threats to it, and then what we can do to help alleviate some of these threats and learn more about it. So I think many of us on this webinar tonight are familiar with the Carp Farmers Market. There are stalls that we visit regularly because they offer food that we like and hopefully that is healthy for us. I know some of us may also visit the bacon on the bun stall, but as you'll see, even wildlife will eat things that aren't good for them. So like all the different stalls at the Carp Farmers Market, there are different ecosystems in the Carp Hills. Here we have a silver-bordered fritillary butterfly that's along a riparian or pond edge. Its larval food source is violets, and it prefers open woodlands. There's also a tricolored bumblebee here on one of the unusual goldenrods that grow on the Carp Barrens. We have a chickadee on cattails. We have the winterberry from the Canadian holly plant that likes to grow along wetlands. Here are caterpillars on upland oak leaves in the Carp Hills. I think these are related to sawflies. These are sawfly type caterpillars. And then we have what is the elegant-tailed slug moth in larval form on the blueberries that are everywhere in the Carp Hills on the acidic substrate. So takeaways from tonight, I'd like you to be thinking about things as we go through the presentation. First is that native plant diversity is critical to sustaining ecological function and biodiversity. And the reason for this is that plants feed insects, and together plants and insects are I'll say the bottom of the food web, but they are the thing that sort of sustains the food web. And just as an example, I mean, who knew that there's some moth that in its larval caterpillar form actually specializes to eat water lilies. This is a photo from the Carp Hills there. And biodiversity itself is critical to providing resilience to rapid change, the pests and diseases and weather extremes. We'll see why it also has other services that it provides. And we know that Carp Hills sustains high biodiversity due to a number of things, the geography, how it's located, the underlying bedrock of its soils, the landscape, the wetlands and the forests, and of course, its wetlands. And biodiversity in the Carp Hills is primarily threatened by mainly human factors because we are introducing rapid change, but there are steps that we can take to reduce our impact. And here's another riparian shoreline, this time filled with orchids growing on sphagnum moss to improve that. So I have a poll for you guys. I have a number of polls to keep you interacted here. So I'd like you to, this is a multiple choice, I'd like you to select which of these things do you think contribute to biodiversity? What types, or what is biodiversity, and what do you think of them? So I'll give you just a few seconds to participate in the poll. And we'll display it. All right, we're almost there. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Almost got everybody in. So here are the results. So you can see the results. So most of you think it's the ecosystem diversity, although it's pretty closely followed by species and genetics. So I'll stop sharing there. And oops, how's that going on? I need to get rid of that. This is the problem when you're the person doing all the running and also trying to do it. So actually biodiversity is equal to ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. So it's all three things in the poll. And ecosystem diversity is the variation in habitats across an area. And the species diversity is defined as all the different species, which are the flora and fauna that are found across the ecosystems. And genetic diversity is the variability of the genes within individuals and of each species. And what we'll see is that the Carp Hills are actually doing pretty well in 1 and 2. We don't have data on 3, but there are reasonable inferences that we can make about some threats to the genetic biodiversity of the Carp Hills, particularly because as populations become smaller and more isolated, they become less genetically diverse. And what we see is that high biodiversity means that there are many species functioning together in a community that creates sustainability. So why is biodiversity important? Well, I've tried to create, or these 3 things are mainly, I would say, very human-centric. And one, we're looking at the ecosystem service aspect of what biodiversity provides. And we've heard a lot of these carbon sequestration in the wetlands and in the forests, the mitigation of flood and drought. So you have wetlands that absorb excess water and then release it slowly in periods of less rain. You have groundwater recharge and water quality protection, which are particularly important for those of us who rely on wells all around the Carp Ridge, such as I do. It's also resilience to disturbances. And if you have a lot of biodiversity, you have a buffer to the unknown. So that because there are a number of different species that some may do better with respect to responding to particular disturbances, others may die off, but you still have something there where you have the genetic diversity that is able to address that. And then they also maintain species balance. And we see that, for example, there are issues where there is imbalance. The white-tailed deer problem, particularly in the eastern US, and we've certainly had it here because the predators have been mostly eliminated. So the species are not kept in balance. You can also end up where you just have too many particular types of insects because there's nothing keeping them in check. Now, we haven't yet had an issue with catastrophic failure of our ecosystems, at least here in Eastern Ontario, but there are other parts of the world that are seeing that and complete loss of biodiversity. And I think the tropical coral bleaching is one example of that. So I'm going to quickly go through some examples of biodiversity. This is related to trees. And one is Dr. Christian Messier, who is a tree diversity researcher at University of Quebec at Montreal in the Outaouais. Now he's done a fair amount of research into why functionally diverse forests are healthier. And he did this when looking in nature, there are different mixes of trees that often grow together. And one that he noted in particular was the sugar maple, white birch, white spruce, and white pine. And he did some controlled testing in various plots. And he showed that that in fact, the trees grow much better when they are in these mixes than if they're in monocultures alone. And I was at a conference where he was speaking and he berated the sugar maple bush guys because a lot of them are growing monocultures of sugar maple. And his view was that it was just a disaster waiting to happen with respect to the fact that their trees were probably not as resilient or healthy and were certainly going to be more susceptible to any disease. His biggest fear is, of course, aliens and being brought into North American forests. And you can certainly read more. I've got a reference at the end where you can read some more of his study. And then on the other side of our country, we have another Canadian researcher is Dr. Suzanne Simard, and she's from UBC, and she doesn't really need any introduction for her rather groundbreaking work on the relationship between the fungal mycelium networks and how they connect trees so that they can share resources. And she also noted that trees grow best in certain groupings. And she's coined the phrase mother trees, which kind of bothers me, but she's trying to get the message across that there are trees that seem to share resources with other trees, particularly ones that are supposedly their own offspring, which I find kind of amazing. But these are just examples of the biodiversity and resiliency aspects. Now we have native trees under threats already here, all due to introduced diseases. And you may look at this, the beech bark disease, the Dutch elm, and the butternut canker and the emerald ash borer. And you may say, well, that's just 4 species. Well, it's actually 8 species, because there are 3 types of elm trees that are susceptible to Dutch elm, and that includes the American elm, the rock elm, and the slippery elm, all of which grow in the Carp Hills. And there's also 3 types of ash trees that are susceptible to the ash borer, which is the black ash, the green ash, and the white ash. Again, all of them growing in the Carp Hills. And in each case, these trees are in different habitats. They prefer to grow in different places. So when you're removing these trees, not just in one type of ecosystem, you're removing them from a number of different ecosystems. And we haven't even talked about the threats of the oak wilt, which is at the border, the northern border, or southern border with the United States. And what that would do, would devastate what is very much of a red oak forest up in the Carp Hills. And we also have the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is in the Maritimes and also coming up from New York. We don't have too many hemlocks left in the Carp Hills. I think they probably used to be more of them there. But it will certainly devastate hemlocks. And we have the elm zigzag sawfly that Owen Clarkin, who I know is on tonight, tracked across Ottawa last summer. And it will no doubt be in carp this summer. It will have made its way across in number by the end of that. We have also this invasive European spongy moth, which used to be called the gypsy moth. It's not all bad news, because one of the things that we've learned here is that although there aren't many birds that eat these European caterpillars because they're very bristly, there are birds that are now eating the egg masses. And I learned this from field naturalist Art Goldsmith, who said that these little holes that you can see the holes here, are actually from birds that are eating the larva, or able to eat the larva in these in the trees. And these were pictures I took in the Carp Hills just last week. So these larval sacs are being eaten, at least by our native birds. So let's talk about why the Carp Hills have high biodiversity. And we talked about the ecosystem diversity. We'll get into that, the species. I'm also like to talk a little bit about the farming. I'm just going to mention it here, and it's sheer speculation on my part. I'm going to make that clear. But I think, you look around the Carp Hills and there are farmlands all surrounding it, right? Because that's where the fertile soil is. It's non-acidic soil. The Carp Hills are mostly quite acidic. There's almost no topsoil. So it was extremely unattractive for farming. And what we do know is that, of course, it was logged a few times. And we also know that there were cattle released up on there, and they certainly had an impact on it. And you can find these old barbed wire fences. This is from my property. This is a corner post. You can find some of the old cedar posts that are still there, haven't rotted away, and the old barbed wire. But I think that despite the cattle and the logging and even the fires, that the wetlands and the peatlands were able to retain a certain store of seeds. And so that's where the biodiversity in the Carp Hills remains. It is in these wetlands that managed to survive the cattle and everything else. But you'll see that they became quite isolated from one another, which is why I think they're all different from one another. So again, this is my speculation. I want to make that clear. But that's what I'm thinking. So of ecosystem diversity. So let's talk about that. So there is this varied environment supporting greater species richness. So here's a new map. This is from the new official plan of the city of Ottawa. And what we have in the middle here is we have the Carp Hills, this all outlined here. And I'm going to come back to this map later and talk about linkages. But what you have is the elevated island of farmland. And at the highest point, the Carp Hills are 130 to 139 meters above sea level. And that's mostly along this sort of southern edge, all right? Because the thing was thrust up along the fault here, and it tips back this way. And what you'll find is that that is about 30 meters above the upper levels of farmland here. So there, these farmland is 90 to 100 meters above sea level. And here we have the upper levels that's 130 to 139 meters, and it tips. And what you'll find, it's interesting, it's actually about the same elevation when you get to about the middle. It's about 100 to 90 meters here as it is over here in the farmland, okay? So what's interesting is that this elevated island is sort of forms a dome. So there, everything flows out of it. There's not a lot of stuff flowing into it. And there have been recent incursions because of the roads and so on, but over time, the disturbance from things coming into it were, I think, relatively less. So certainly from all the water and everything, it's all flowing out of the Carp Hills. So go to the next one. And this is a map from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and they actually, you can look at watersheds. And this is the line that they drew on the Carp Hills. Here's the Carp Road here, number 5. There's the village here. And as you can see, most of the Carp Hills, they drains into the Constance Creek, and then thus into the Ottawa River. And then on this side, right along the edge, it drains into the Carp River, which ultimately again makes it into the Ottawa River. So that's where most of the water is flowing. And if we look at the again, more of the geography here, what we have is a core of, well, it's all Precambrian shield, and this is March Road and Kinburn Side Roads up here. You have basically all Precambrian shield, but the core here of the most biodiverse area is the acidic gneissic rock with some igneous intrusions. That is considered this unique aspect of the Carp Hills within the city of Ottawa. There's nothing else quite like this within the city. And I've shown this map before when I did the presentation a year ago on the Carp Hills, but this is the geology. And so here's the Carp Hills down here. Here's this Hazeldean fault that is where the hills are thrust up along that fault and are sloped that way. But what you'll notice is the similarity in formations with the Gatineau Hills over here. And there are 3 really separate types of rock formations, Precambrian rock formations. We have the gneissic rock, which is a metamorphosed form of granite. We have marble, which is a metamorphosed form of limestone. So it's calcareous, that means it's more alkaline. And you get it right at the start of the Crazy Horse Trail. And then later when you get past Thomas Dolan Parkway. But then you get these igneous intrusions. So these were upwellings of cyanite. And again, so this diversity of geology, you've got these 3 different kinds. And so you've got this acidic gneiss, I should say, the calcareous marble, and you get this cyanite with feldspar. And that is predominantly potassium, which is also a nutrient. And you'll actually see these differences along in the Carp Hills. Like whenever you find things like sugar maples and things like that, trilliums, you're either in a marble area, which are very few and far between, or you're in one of these cyanite plutons. And they find it because it's providing a bit more nutrients than it otherwise would allow. So again, moving on to more of the landscape or more of the ecosystem diversity. So, you now have this island with this different geologies, but there's also this, how the landscape presents itself. So you've got all this folded, exposed rock. You also have thin soils, but there are places where there are swamps and some thicker soils. You get this mix of bedrocks, extremes of wet and dry, forested uplands, and wetlands and rock barrens. And this wetland is also quite interesting because it's a wetland complex, which means everything is connected. It's defined by the province as wetlands that are functionally linked to one another by no more than 750 meters apart. So indeed, that's what you have in the Carp Hills. There's actually it's known for its springs. A lot of these wetlands are connected overland. Some of them we think are connected underland. I'll talk later about a pond that I'm fairly certain has a spring. And so again, you have some of these connections, but you also find that these wetlands have become isolated over time. So I have a poll now on what type of wetlands are in the Carp Hills. So I'm going to launch my other poll here. So let's see. How do I get to the next poll? Wetland types. All right, so you can, this is multiple choice, and it's what types of wetlands are in the Carp Hills. So you can choose all that apply. Oops, I have, yeah, you guys can see that poll, I assume, so good. All right, I think almost everyone's voted. Almost everyone voted. Okay, so we'll end the poll, share the results. So most everyone got this right. There are actually 5 different types of wetlands. We have marshes, swamps, shallow ponds, fens, and bogs. So that's good. So we'll go to the next one. So here they are. So there's 5 types of wetlands as defined by there's Canadian sources that define these. And the marshes and the swamps are the most common. And what are less common, particularly in the city of Ottawa, because they've all been drained, are the fens and bogs. We'll talk more about them in how they offer biodiversity. So I want to talk a little bit about peat in the Carp Hills. I just finished a fascinating book of peatlands, and this is Carp Hills fen. So what is peat? Now we in Canada peat as the moss, particularly sphagnum moss, and that's certainly true. Peat is the organic layer of soil consisting of partially decomposed organic matter derived from plant material, which is accumulated usually in wet anaerobic, that is without oxygen and in high acidic and conditions. And there's not a lot of nutrients in peat. And I should say that there has recently been someone who's done some coring of the peatlands for the land trust, and they were still going at 3 feet deep. So there's a fair amount of peat that has been accumulating since the last glaciation retreated. Last glaciers retreated in the Carp Hills. So we talked about how our northern area, it's mostly made of the sphagnum moss, but there are also peatlands in tropical areas. In the Everglades, peat is made from sawgrass. You can have mangrove peatlands. You can have grass peatlands. There are peatlands in Hawaii. There are peatlands in the Mojave Desert, believe it or not. And the interesting thing about peatlands is that they store many times more carbon than in the same area than forests. But they will release this back if they are dried and mined over time. So one of the things that I have on our website is that every wetland is a different food stall at the market. And when you go into these, are 4 particular fens that have been documented, and we've had knowledgeable people in to actually take a look at all the different plants. And every one of these 4 fens has a different set of plants and different sets of insects that are inhabiting and eating those plants. So each one of these has one common plant is the 3-way sedge, which is actually uncommon in Ottawa. 3 of them have Carnivorous Sundews. 3 of them have leatherleaf, which is a host for the brown elfin butterfly. 2 of them have the extremely rare filiform cottongrass. That's what you're seeing here. That's only other place it's found is in Mare Bleu Bog on the east end of Ottawa. And we don't, although these all contain peat, these are all layers of sphagnum moss. They are not extensive. I think the largest fen is probably, as I recall, is about 2 acres in size, whereas the Mare Bleu Bog is, well, you'll see it's a couple thousand or 3,000 hectares, as I recall. I just wanted to highlight quickly the richest fen, and it's rich because in terms of its plant systems. And here's a view of the fen from the Crazy Horse Trail. You can actually see it from the bridge that you're around the beaver pond. And this is standing looking the other way, the beaver pond here. One of the reasons I think this is wet, and again, this is speculation, or why I think it's rich, this is speculation, is I think that this pond is spring fed. And that means there are more nutrients that are in this pond. And I think this fen, because it's also connected to a pond, it's got more nutrients flowing in it. And there are a number of reasons why I think this pond has a spring. There's often a hot spot on it in the winter where the ice is thinner. If you look at historical photos, unlike many of the beaver ponds in the Carp Hills, this is always wet. This pond never, ever drains. And the other reason is the temperature of the water. And it was ecologist Kathy Keddy made the comment to me when she had her hand in the water last year of how cold it was, even in July. And that's an indicator for a pond that's certainly deeper and likely being fed by a spring. So this riparian fen has a number of unusual plants. We talked about the carnivorous sundews. For those who don't know what it is over here, these are the sort of tentacles, if you will, that have the sticky mucus that excretes a sort of sugary mix that attracts plants it attracts insects, and then they're captured in the stickiness, and then they're slowly digested by enzymes released by the carnivorous sundew. And one of the reasons that there are often carnivorous plants in fens is because the nutrients are so poor, so that it supplements its diet by eating insects. There's also this extremely unusual clubspur orchid. They're spread all across that, and this unusual sedge in this fen. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk to you guys about is how unusual a lot of these areas in the Carp Hills are. This is a view of the Carp River at Craig's Side Road. This is a view, there's a Carp River is right over here at Palladium Drive. And people who drive by would go, wow, look at these wonderful natural areas. Okay, look at how great that is. There's all that nature, there's trees, right? There's grass, there's flowers, whatever. But I have walked in those and I have documented what's in here, and there is not a lot of biodiversity in that. In fact, what's worse is the Craig Side Road site, believe it or not, is worse than the Palladium Side Road. There are essentially a lot of dying native trees. There's certainly the elms and ash are dying here and here. But there's also a huge amount of non-native plants. We'll get into that. There's buckthorn and honeysuckle, there's mullein. And there's very, very little numbers of species of plants in both of these locations. And I think that's what we have to kind of drive home tonight, is that we're seeing these generalist species over and over again in all the disturbed sites across Ottawa. And it's places like the Carp Hills, and we'll talk about some of the others, that are these reservoirs left in Ottawa that still have this biodiversity. So now let's begin. This is our introduction now to the species diversity, which is all the different flora and fauna. All right, so one of the things that the Carp Hills have is it supports the number of species at risk, and I've certainly talked about these in the past. There's all the 3 different types of turtles. I believe there's 8 turtles in Ontario. All of them are species at risk. We have 3 of them in the Carp Hills. We have the number of birds, the butternut as well, and of course we support the monarch butterfly. There's swamp milkweed in the Carp Hills that may be used by but certainly they're the pollinated are being used. So I'm going to have to get into a little bit of detail here, and I apologize for that, but we have to talk about the Brunton vascular plants list if we're going to talk about measuring biodiversity. And remember, it's all about plants and then insects. So this is Daniel Brunton is a well-known ecologist who's done much work in the Ottawa area, and he came up with this vascular plants inventory for the whole region of Ottawa back in 2005. And he identified 1,569 plant species, and we'll talk, that's both native and non-native. And he categorized them into regionally rare, regionally significant, uncommon, whatever, okay? And the vascular plants are the trees, the shrubs, the flowering plants, ferns, and horsetails. They do not include fungi, which aren't really a plant, or lichens, which aren't really a plant, mosses, liverworts, or hornworts, okay? So that's the trees, shrubs, flowering shrubs, and everything else, okay? So we have to make sure we understand that. So when you take a look at the vascular plants, this is his number 1569. What we have right now documented in iNaturalist is we have 423. Of that, there are 354 are research grade. And 61 of these, of the research grade, are non-native, but that compares relatively to the non-native of here. So, it's about a third, right? So a little bit around a third. And we have regionally rare species. We have 15 regionally significant. That is, there's 6 to 10 more in 6 to 10 locations in Ottawa where they exist, and we have about 83. And I've compiled this not only from Brunton's list, but also from various other sources, iNaturalist, a duck property ecological study, Carp Barren study, and trail and landscape articles. But I think there's probably more than this number, because I haven't been able to count everything that's in the list and gone through all of iNaturalist yet to get every single species identified. If we compare this to some of the other highly diverse areas in Ottawa, the Carp Hills comes out somewhat in the middle. So here's the Marlboro Forest. It's the kind of the king of biodiversity, or the queen of biodiversity. It's twice the size of the Carp Hills. It has extremely diverse set of wetlands. And it has this number, at least according to the Brunton list, which is now 17 years old, has 74 different regionally rare and significant species. And you can kind of check, each one of these. The common denominator between all of these, except for the Constance-based sandhills, is that they are all wetlands, right? They're all areas that some of them support peatlands, but they are all wetlands or shallow ponds. And so for that reason, they are the reservoirs of diversity within the city of Ottawa. So I've been talking a lot about the plants and why are we focusing on them? And plants, as we said, enable animals to eat sunlight. They're at the bottom of the food chain. We know that photosynthesis takes the energy from the sun and converts it into carbohydrates and oxygen. And the insects are the best animals at transferring energy from plants to other animals. They are often specialized in what they eat, and the native insects have evolved to eat our native plants. So this is an important point. So this is just a visual of what I just told you. Here's the sun. There's a serviceberry in the Carp Hills. It has flowers, it has leaves, it has fruit. It's feeding all these different things. It feeds butterflies and moths early in the season. Some of the early pollinators use its nectar. Its leaves feed various caterpillars and moths, butterfly and moth caterpillars, and its fruit feeds all these. So what has happened is that the evolution is that the native plant species provide this right chemistry of nutrients for the native animals, particularly the insects, and that alien or non-native species are nutritionally unavailable to native animals. That is the insects, birds, and frogs. They are not providing the nutrition, or in some cases, they can't even be eaten by the native plants, by the native animals. So here's an example of a couple of non-native species. These are ones that we see over and over again all across the city. Is buckthorn. This is one of the two types of non-native, the glossy buckthorn and the Tartarian honeysuckle. And these things grow berries, and the animals do eat the berries. And the thing is, you say, oh, okay, they're berries, this is good. Well, the problem is that there's not a lot of nutrition in those berries, right? So essentially, they're junk food, right? And there's two things that I've sort of, one has been my observation. I was recently on a trail just last week and came upon some scat from looked like probably a raccoon. And in that scat were completely undigested crab apples, which of course are non-native, and some barely digested Tartarian honeysuckle berries. And I know that I actually found that particular shrub, another 100 feet away or whatever. But essentially what it said is that animal, whatever it had eaten the crab apple and the berries, and it hadn't even digested them. It hadn't received really any nutrition from having eaten those. It could not digest them. The other thing was, and from a book I was reading, is that the berries of non-native plants that are produced in the fall, they may be high in sugar, but they're not high in fat. And in fact, birds in particular need berries that are high in fat to get them either through the winter or with enough energy to migrate. So essentially, they're eating these high carbohydrate berries, and it's really not providing the type of food that they need. Whereas our berries, particularly the winter berries and the dogwood and the viburnums, these are all fall berries that provide, and this has been researched, they provide a higher fat diet. I don't think the elderberry does. That's actually born in the summer, but it is a native berry, so I included it here. And you might say, well, why are these animals eating the junk food? Well, I guess it's the same question of why we would eat the Tim Horton donut, right, instead of the bran muffin. It tastes good, right? They don't know any better. They didn't grow up with these plants, or they didn't evolve to not know that these plants do not provide the nutrition that they need. So those guys are good. So you get a lot of specialization as well in between the plants and the various animals. And here's an interesting one, is that the prickly ash plant, and this is on the Hidden Lake Trail, is actually in the citrus family. And recently, the giant swallowtail butterfly, which is a native to North America, has expanded its range into Ontario and into Ottawa. And the only thing it can eat, it has to eat citrus family plants. And the only thing it can really eat, at least in our area, is the prickly ash. And here's a caterpillar on prickly ash at High Lonesome. Where did I take that one? I should have said at High Lonesome Nature Reserve. And then here's the actual caterpillar here. And it's from High Lonesome. I should put that. So another specialist is the Baltimore checker spot caterpillar. Now it actually can survive on a few plants, or its larva can survive on a few plants. But in our area, the main one is the turtlehead. This is white turtlehead, which you can find scattered throughout the Carp Hills. Now here is a white Baltimore checker spot, and it's on an ash tree. You're going, well, you just told me it only eats that. Well, in fact, what it does is the butterfly lays the eggs on the white turtlehead. It mainly munches there, but then from what I've been reading, it will actually will wander onto some other plants, but it has to have this initial plant in order to grow enough to allow it to wander. And finally, what we have here is a buttonbush. These are also an uncommon plant in the Ottawa area, but there's quite a number of them in the Carp Hills. And it is a host plant for the hydrangea sphinx moth. And I couldn't find a larval photo for around the Ottawa area, but this is one of the actual moth itself in Constance Bay. So you'll actually find the greatest amount of specialization among the caterpillars, whether they're moth caterpillars or they're butterfly caterpillars. And often they must have a particular type of plant, or maybe they have 2 or 3 plants, and the moths or butterflies must lay their eggs on that plant so that the larva has the chemicals in its body that allow it to digest and to receive nutrients. And we know other kinds of specialization, because it can actually be a danger to be very specialized. And everyone knows about the monarchs. And these are monarchs feeding on bidens on a Carp Hills marsh. This is the swamp milkweed. We know about the common milkweed. It must lay its eggs on a milkweed because its larvae have been specialized to be able to digest what is otherwise a toxic plant. Another one is the bog bean. And we did actually find bog bean in one and only one fen so far in the Carp Hills. And there is a particular moth, it's endangered in Ontario, called the bog bean buck moth. And they're in Ontario, there are only 2 places it's known to exist. And one of them is the White Lake Fen. And I've actually been privileged to be out on the White Lake Fen with Michael Runce searching for Bog Bean buck moths. And I've been out there twice in the last 5 years to look for them. And the numbers are declining. In fact, last time we didn't find a single one. And the problem is that this moth has to lay its larva on this bog bean. Now, are there any of these moths in the Carp Hills? No, we've never seen them. I would say that the population in the Carp Hills is probably too small to even sustain a moth population. So this is the dangers of specialization. So in summary on the non-native plants, they don't support native insects. The animals that eat insects like birds then are therefore not being fed, because if you're only feeding the, if you only have plants available that can't feed insects that your birds need, well, there's less insects for your birds to eat. It's not providing specialist pollinators if there particular types of flower shapes are there for them, that they're not getting those. So the complex food webs are not being supported, and biodiversity is being lost. So these are all junk food. And unfortunately, what we see, like, people still are planting Scots pines and Norway maples and other things like that. So again, more on the biodiversity in the Carp Hills. We'll talk now about birds very quickly. In eBird, which is a citizen science application, you can see the number of species that have been recorded as of December 2021. Really, the Carp Barrens is quite phenomenal at 192. Now you may say, oh, well, that's only 21 in Ottawa. But again, all the areas that are ahead of it, they're all along major waterways. So the number one is the Britannia conservation area. So they're often all along the major, and so they're getting all of the shorebirds and a lot of the birds that need large waterways in order to reproduce, or where they use them for migration. So this 192 in the Carp Barrens is actually quite an impressive number. And as we mentioned, we often talk about the reduction in bird populations, and a lot is talked about with respect to the loss of tropical habitat, because many of these birds, they migrate up north, and but they winter down in the south. And certainly the loss of the tropical habitat has got to be an issue. But the other thing that is an issue is, of course, this declining insect populations, because we are losing all of our native plants. And there was a study in Delaware on the quantity of caterpillars in native and non-native hedgerows. And the caterpillars are one of the top insects eaten or fed to nestlings because they provide a high protein, high energy diet. And in terms of plant biomass in hedgerows with non-native species, there were 68 fewer caterpillar species, 91% fewer caterpillars, and 96% less caterpillar biomass as compared to hedgerows with native species of plants. So there's a view that our insect populations are declining, and that in turn is causing our bird populations to decline. And one other point I would make is that there's also been a discussion is, why do we have migration from the tropics up north? And one of the reasons is just the massive amount of insects that come out when we have this new flush of growth in the spring. And there's nothing like that in the tropics. It's all the same, it's all the same. There is a raining season and so on, but the birds evolved to take advantage of this massive protein smorgasbord, all the food stalls up north, and because they needed all the energy associated with these insects. And so as these insects are declining, we're seeing a decline in our bird species. These are some of the reptiles and amphibians in the Carp Hills, and we have a couple of regionally significant snakes. One is the milk snake here, and the smooth green snake, which are found in the Carp Barrens. We also have, I mentioned, all three turtles. There's a Blanding's turtle, and we have 3 known salamander species. So really, we haven't really studied the salamanders in any depth at this point. And I'll mention the Lichen Diversity. And we talked about lichens when I did my webinar last year. They're actually a combination of a fungus plus an alga. The main thing is we recently had a lichen expert out on the Carp Barrens. And as his comment was, for me, what stands out about the lichen population on the Barrens is the diversity of species in such a relatively small area. And when he and I chatted, and he wrote the article for our newsletter, that was the main thing he said. There wasn't anything highly unusual on the Carp Barrens. It was just that there were so many different species on the Carp Barrens. And with respect to insect diversity in the Carp Hills, well, we really haven't got a clue. I mean, I looked, there are 211 research grade entries in iNaturalist for 106 species, but most of those are the charismatic species, which are the dragonflies and the damselflies and the butterflies. Those are the ones that have been documented. There's a few bees, but really that's it. There's not much has been documented up there. So, you know, these are the guys we're talking about tonight. These are the ones that are eating these native plants, and we really don't know very much about them. I did mention that what is also interesting about insects is the timing of when they're available. So this autumn meadowhawk, it is known for coming out late in October. So it's sort of one of the last snacks that you can have before heading south, is to eat a number of these meadowhawks. And so, you know, you start to eliminate some of the insects that are different times of the year. Well, you're changing what's at the food stall for the animals that may need to get through the winter. In genetic diversity, this is the variability of genes of individuals in each species. Again, we haven't measured the genetic diversity in the Carp Hills, but if you look at the issue, is we've got habitat fragmentation, which means we've got populations that are becoming isolated. Already we have the Carp Hills as an island itself. We saw the map. We have species islands within the Carp Hills we'll talk about, and we have all these rare species. So this is the diagram I showed you before, but I've now annotated it to show how it relates to all these other biodiverse places. And if you remember my list before, we talked about the Constance Creek, the Sandhills, the Morris Islands, South March Highlands, Surly's Bay, Stony Swamp, Long Swamp. These were all listed when we were trying to compare all the number of rare species. Well, they're all isolated from one another. And one of the things that the official plan talks about is how important these eco-linkages are. These are all these dotted areas. So the Carp River is considered a vital eco-linkage. This is an eco-linkage here. None of these eco-linkages, though, are protected. A lot of them are privately owned, they're potentially developable, but what you end up with essentially is you can lose all these eco-linkages and you end up by further isolating all the species. I know one of the things that was talked about with one of the city ecologists is the importance of the Carp River keeping the South March Highlands connected to the Carp Hills, particularly for the migration of turtle species. So, you know, we just actually, I should say, the Friends of the Carp Hills recently completed a strategic plan. And one of the things we want to focus on is how can we help the city try to retain or protect some of these eco-linkages, which are incredibly important. You also have these species islands in the Carp Hills. This is a photo of the bog that I have on my property. It's extremely small. I don't even think it's an acre. Within this bog are 3 plants. Well, there's a few more, but these 3 plants, Labrador tea, sheep laurel, and black spruce, I have not found these anywhere else in the Carp Hills. I mean, I've been in many, many wetlands. I have crawled through ticks and mosquitoes and black flies, and I have not found these anywhere else. And you know, back before the cattle and everything, and the lumbering and everything else gone up there, these had to be also up in other places in the Carp Hills. But over time, this is just the last place where they exist. And that means that the genetic diversity has got to be in decline. There is no other, they're just all interbreeding. And in fact, the black spruce, I think there were 2 in the bog, they've died. This is the last black spruce that I know of in the Carp Hills. So we have all, you know, the isolated wetlands are gone. We also now have these regionally rare species. And, you know, as as field naturalists, we celebrate these. We love to find them, but the problem is that they're rare because they're or because they're rare, they're also quite susceptible to actually being extirpated in our area. And these are the 15 regionally rare species in the Carp Hills. And some of you may be looking at the bottom going, huh, jack pine, they're everywhere. Well, that's certainly true. But their jack pine is, the Carp Hills are one of the last places where there's naturally occurring jack pine in our area. These orchids are all probably, they're certainly quite rare. Some of the grasses are quite rare. This hump bladderwort, it's only been found in the Carp Hills in the Ottawa area. It's not found anywhere else. And that's what you're finding, is that all the biodiversity that's left in the Ottawa area is concentrating in these islands of wetlands and peatlands. So the threats to biodiversity, and I call this death by 1,000 cuts while loving it to death. And that's where we are. So I'm going to ask you now, I've got another poll, is what do you think are the top 3 threats to biodiversity in the Carp Hills? So let me get this one going here. So you get to have 3 choices. It's only 3. And you can use the sidebar to scroll down to the last one. Got 8. All right, we're going. All right, so that gets us pretty well to the end of the poll. So I'll share the results. So most people think it's the invasive species and the loss of ecological connectivity, the land fragmentation, and then the quantity of people. And that's pretty close. You know, this is of course going to be again, a personal opinion, but certainly almost all of these are contributing. So I'm gonna go to here. So the threats to biodiversity, certainly the loss of connectivity, we talked about that. We have the fragmentation within the Carp Hills itself, and more people is certainly an issue. We'll talk about that. The reduction in species population sizes and invasive species and climate change. So the fragmentation, this is really what we have going on within the Carp Hills. We have more trails, new houses, new roads, and they all bring more human and pet traffic. Now we are part of nature, but what's happening is that the way we live and just the sheer number of us, we are having, we do have an impact on the habitats we bring in invasive species on our boots and on dog paws. We disrupt wildlife. We drain wetlands in a lot of cases, and it has caused, I think, the lumbering and everything else that has basically caused a loss of some of the biodiversity in the Carp Hills. In the reduction in species population size, I have an example, and one we're quite worried about is the Blandings turtle. They're threatened by road traffic, trail traffic, and nest predation. It takes 25 years for a female Blandings turtle to get to breeding maturity. You lose one female when there's a small number of them in a population. You could drop below the threshold that's needed to sustain the population. And it's not something that you would notice overnight. You might still see your Blandings around, and then suddenly they will just eventually be gone. And I think that's, as I said, what we're worrying about. This is a graphic from Dave Seaburn's presentation, and we'll talk about, Dave is actually giving us a presentation in a few weeks on saving turtles. There were over 1,400 turtles dead on roads in this area. So you can see here's Canada. Here's the Mississippi Mills. So it's not just Ottawa, but in the whole area, mostly the western and southwestern end. And so I zoomed in. This is Thomas Dolan Parkway. Like this is the Carp Hills here, and there's Thomas Dolan Parkway, right? And so it's kind of this hotspot of turtle death. And I think this is one of the reasons why the turtle barriers were put up last year, is to try to prevent this. So, but still the turtles were getting out, which means barriers. So these are two dead turtles. There's one on Thomas Dolan Parkway last year. This is another one, Dave Seaburn on Marchhurst Road. Here's a snapper crossing Thomas Dolan. So it's an issue, right? And here's one, I took a photo and Jacob took a photo of the same one, found a Blandings turtle dead right beside the Crazy Horse Trail in 2020. And I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure that was killed by a dog. It wasn't eaten. It looked like to be a healthy turtle. It was right beside a crossing where I know the turtles cross. And I know there's a lot of people who let their dogs off leash. So again, I can't prove it, but I'm fairly certain that turtle was killed by a dog. The nests are also often laid, they're laying their eggs in the Carp Barrens right by the trail. It's very thin soil. What you find is that the trails are used not only by people, but they're used by wildlife, and that the nests are quickly predated by things like raccoons and skunks and fishers. So we get to then invasive species, and you guys have heard this over and over again. We've already talked about non-native species and that they are junk food. Invasive species are not only junk food, they are also aggressive colonizers. They crowd out native species, and so they are the kind of the worst of the non-natives. They will create monocultures. We bring in invasive species. Humans do it, dog paws, wind, birds. I mean, one of the reasons buckthorn is such a problem is the birds do eat the seeds. They pass through not very digested and they poop them out almost everywhere. So it's extremely hard to control the buckthorn. This was actually taken in the Carp Hills by a biologist. This photo, it shows that the purple loosestrife here is being eaten by the European beetles that were released back in, when did I write, 1992. There were beetles released, and so that program apparently has at least been working, but this is where we had to take a non-native beetle to kill off or control a non-native plant. And what you'll find as well is when you walk along the trails, is that it's the non-native species are most observable and concentrated along the trails because they are being brought in on boots and paws. And then there is the climate change element, and I see it as an amplifier of the ecological stress. It's mostly because it's so rapid. And the problem that we have is that all this rapid change, the plants and the animals, they don't have the time to evolve. And so what we're finding is that food webs get disrupted, and we're seeing rapid range expansion of native pests and diseases. We're creating favorable conditions for non-native pests, and we're seeing these weather extremes. And it goes back to why biodiversity is important, because if there's some plants out there that are able to withstand this, or there's some part of the gene pool that is more resistant to some of these things, then we may not lose them. And an example, I do want to use black-legged ticks because they didn't used to be up here. Now they're a native insect, or a native arachnid. No, I don't know. Actually, not sure what they are. But anyway, they're a native animal, and they have expanded north. Because the seasons are longer, allowing them to go through their full cycle of reproduction, or go through a cycle of reproduction. And that was not possible before. They are actually fairly cold hardy, but they didn't used to have the length of season that allowed them to reproduce. And they don't actually carry the bacteria of Lyme disease originally when they're larvae. They actually have to feed on mice and chipmunks, which actually carry the bacteria, and then that bacteria becomes part of the blood meal, and then they can transmit it when they have their next blood meal. And part of the problem is that we also, not only do we need mice, which aren't being controlled necessarily by predators, but then you also need the deer population, which also is large. So we've kind of got this imbalance in our ecosystem, as well as getting amplified by the climate change temperature differences. So we have now, what can you do? So at this point, you may be getting kind of depressed, right? So I don't want you to be depressed. So I have a moment of hope here. These are two different landing turtles, and they are doing what you think they're doing. They were taken in 2021 by biologist Rich Russell in the Crazy Horse Trail area. And so yes, they're Blandings turtles, and hopefully they're reproducing. So what can you do? So we go back to planting native species wherever you live. And we need to create a web of native plants across our rural and suburban properties. And Douglas Tallamy, Nature's Best Hope. If you read one book, I would recommend that this is the one you pick up and get it at the library or buy it. He calls it Homegrown National Park. If you plant these native plants, it will feed the insects, it will feed the birds, it will feed other animals. And it is it's not even a sacrifice to do this, really. We had a webinar back in February by Lana Doss, and she did a really nice job of talking about gardening with nature. So if you're looking for some guidance on how you can plant native plants, I suggest you look up that webinar on our YouTube channel. And we also ask that, unless you have to not use pesticides and to use natural fertilizers sparingly. Because, if you put rotenone to kill the European beetles, well, you're probably then, if the flowers are out, you're killing the bees because they're busy trying to pollinate or take nectar from your flowers, but they're getting killed by the rotenone that kills the beetles, the Japanese beetles that you put on there. So don't do that. So what else can you do if you're beyond your garden is to stay on the trails. We do offer trails in the Carp Hills. The Friends of the Carp Hills have two. People need to experience the Carp Hills who don't live there. We think that's good, but we really need people to stay on the trails, not forage or dig up plants. That's actually not allowed on any of the city property. Please follow the dog regulations. I have a dog. I love my dog. If you're on your own property, that's fine. It's one dog on your property. The problem is the volume of dogs on the public trails, the volume of dogs that are running off leash, and that the poop is accumulating, it's fouling the water. And of course, the Carp Barrens Trail doesn't allow dogs at all due to its sensitive ecology. And we also ask that you observe the Carp Barrens Trail closure as well to allow the turtles and the birds to nest. If you're a landowner in the Carp Hills, there's a lot that you can do. It's keeping your property as natural as possible. Consider planting the native species, things that are suitable. We ask, I guess, that you consider either donating your property to a land trust or placing it under a conservation easement. We're hoping to hear an announcement this year of a few more properties that will get protected. Waiting to hear on that. We'll be launching a landowner stewardship program to provide some guidance to landowners. My 300 acres is all set up to be donated for protection. So keep that core as natural as possible. And that is one of our main goals. So here's the learn more slide. For you on, again, mentioning Dr. Douglas Tallamy's Nature's Best Hope. He also has his Bringing Nature Home and some great YouTube lectures. Edward Struzik is a Canadian author. He's written this fascinating book about peatlands I just finished called Swamplands. Highly recommend that. There's writings by Dr. Christian Messier and Suzanne Simard. This is her autobiography. may not be quite what some people are looking for, but it does talk about all her research and her looking at the forest in a different way than other foresters, which I found quite fascinating. There's Lana's been a webinar. If you're interested in all the birds on your property and you're like me with poor audio memory, I recommend you download the Merlin app. It's free, and it actually has AI sound ID. I have learned so much about the number of birds on my property that, you know, I never see them, but I hear them, and now I know what they are. And of course, the Friends of the Carp Hills website. I also, if you haven't signed up already, Saving Ottawa Turtles, this is Dave Seaburn. We are working with him on a couple of turtle conservation projects this year. And Dave has long been involved in the Carp Hills in collecting eggs and for incubation and then releasing them in the Carp Hills. So I think you'll find his presentation really interesting. So again, the takeaways for tonight: remember, plants feed insects. Plants and insects feed almost everything. Grow native plants. That's the big takeaway. And hope you guys will go out and plant some more. And I do want to finish by saying we're not telling people you can't, you know, live in the Carp Hills and you can't, you know, go out on trails and do things. We're just trying to strike a balance and to ask people to be respectful of nature. So I have a final poll. And this is going to be what you found most interesting in tonight's webinar. And this will be useful to me. I would appreciate some feedback. And I'm going to have another question for you guys just before the end that you can put into chat. So just what was the one thing you found most interesting? Or heaven forbid, maybe you didn't find any of it interesting. Hopefully you did. All right, we're up to 11, 13, 14, 15. All right, only ever seem to get, 16. There we go, 16. All right, we'll end the poll, come back, watch, show the results. Okay, so most of you found the species diversity and the ecosystem diversity the most interesting. Okay. And we got kind of depressed on the threats. What? You didn't find what you can do interesting. All right. All right. So the final thing then is in the chat. Oops. Is if you'd like to leave a note on any topics that you'd like the Friends of the Carp Hills to cover in future webinars, just let us know. So I'll just stop sharing my screen. I'm going to exit. I'm going to stop sharing.